Hey everyone, Derek Lambert here, and today we're going to tackle one of the most common claims Christian apologists love to throw around, that the Gospels are eyewitness accounts of real events. You've maybe heard this before from a pastor, maybe from your family, maybe from some guy on YouTube, which is common, with way too much confidence and not enough critical thinking. The claim goes something like this. Matthew was written by Matthew, the disciple. John was written by John, the beloved disciple. These guys were there, man. They saw it. And look, I get why this argument is appealing. If the Gospels really were written by eyewitnesses, that would be pretty significant for many people. With what I know about eyewitness claims, from Bigfoot roaming just beyond human civilization, to UFOs abducting people for strange experiments, to the ancient claims about Romulus ascending to heaven, or the Emperor Vespasian healing a blind man and a man's withered hand. I don't personally, and this is just me, I don't personally trust testimony that is beyond belief unless it happened to me. Just being honest. Who can say they know the motives of these people, or that they are giving accurate information? How do we know that it isn't invented propaganda? Would a modern evangelical think it beyond belief that the Prophet Muhammad or the Prophet Joseph Smith made up the experiences of the angel, visions of God appearing to them, giving real revelation? One of the biggest accusations I get from modern apologists is that I'm so close-minded to the miraculous. This may be true on some level, that I think miraculous claims in ancient literature is more often fictional in nature, though I could toss this accusation back at them for the thousands more miracles performed by other gods and demigods in other literature, which they are completely immune to believing happened, and would categorize this as fiction. But let's put the miraculous to the side, because it isn't needed for this case I'm bringing today. I'm being completely transparent that this is how I personally see the New Testament material. The apologists assume the Gospels are depicting authentic eyewitness testimony. They will literally die on this hill at all costs. But here's the problem, and it's a big one. The Gospels themselves don't read like eyewitness accounts. Not even close. In fact, when you actually sit down and read these texts carefully, you'll notice something weird. The Gospel writers describe scenes, conversations, and even people's private thoughts that no human being could possibly have witnessed. They write like novelists, with a God's eye view of everything that happened. They write like they're omniscient. So today, we're going to walk through some of the most obvious examples of this omniscient narration, and then we'll deal with the apologetic counter-argument, the whole undesigned coincidence thing that's been making the rounds lately. First, let's define our terms. In literature, an omniscient narrator is an all-knowing storyteller who can describe any event, even secret ones, and who can tell you exactly what characters are thinking and feeling. This is super common in fiction. Think of any novel you've read where the author jumps into different characters' heads and describes scenes happening in multiple locations at once. That's omniscient narration. Now here's the thing. If the Gospels were actually based on eyewitness testimony, we would not expect to see omniscient narration. We'd expect the authors to say things like, "We don't know what happened next because none of us were there," or "We're not sure exactly what Jesus said in that moment." You know, like actual witnesses do when they're being honest about the limits of their knowledge. Anyone in today's time would see that. But do we see that in the Gospels? No, not once. The Gospel writers never admit uncertainty about anything. They describe every scene with total confidence, as if they had a front row seat to the entire universe. Let me give you some examples. Let's start with the temptation narrative in Matthew 4 and Luke 4. After Jesus gets baptized, he goes off into the wilderness for 40 days where Satan shows up and tempts him 3 times. Turn these stones into bread. Throw yourself off the temple. Worship me and I'll give you all the kingdoms of the world. Now here's my question. Who witnessed this conversation? Jesus hasn't called any disciples yet. By the text's own account, Jesus is completely alone with the devil. Not a single follower is there. It's just Jesus and Satan hanging out in the desert, having a theological debate about whether Jesus should sell out for some bread and political power. And yet, the Gospels give us a detailed blow-by-blow account of their entire dialogue. Every temptation, every response, word for word. They even include the specific scripture passages Jesus quotes back at Satan. So, who reported this? Did Satan stop by the disciples' camp later and say, "Hey guys, I just wanted to let you know what I said to your Lord the other day. Really thought I had him with that bread thing"? Did Jesus come back from the wilderness and brag to his followers later about his debate skills? You should have seen the look on the devil's face when I quoted Deuteronomy at him. The Gospels don't say. They don't even try to explain how anyone could know this. They just tell the story as if the author was hiding behind a rock with a notepad, taking minutes of the whole encounter. Some apologists will say, well, maybe Jesus told the disciples about it later. Sure, maybe, but here's the thing. The Gospels never say that. It's pure speculation invented to plug a hole in the narrative. And even if Jesus did recount this story, it's pretty weird that the supposedly humble Son of God would go around telling people about the time he totally owned the devil in a desert showdown. This is textbook omniscient narration. It only makes sense if you're writing a legend or a theological story, not if you're recording actual eyewitness testimony. Okay, let's fast forward to the night before Jesus dies. In Matthew 26, Mark 14, and Luke 22, Jesus takes his disciples to the Garden of Gethsemane. He brings Peter, James, and John a little closer, then goes off by himself, about a stone's throw away, Luke tells us, and starts praying. And what are the disciples doing while Jesus pours out his anguish to God? They're sleeping. The Gospels are very clear about this. Jesus comes back multiple times and finds them passed out. Could you not watch with me 1 hour, Jesus asks. Apparently not, Lord. They're catching Z's while you're having an existential crisis. Yet somehow, the Gospels record the exact words Jesus prayed. My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. Or, not my will be done, but yours. Hold on. Let's think about this for a second. The disciples were unconscious. Jesus was alone. He deliberately separated himself from them to pray privately. And immediately after this, Judas shows up with soldiers to arrest Jesus. There's no time for Jesus to sit down with the boys and recap his prayer. Hey guys, before they haul me away, let me tell you what I prayed word for word while you were snoring. That conversation never happens. Jesus is arrested, tried, and executed. The disciples scatter. So how do Matthew, Mark, and Luke know exactly what Jesus said in that garden? They don't. They can't. This is the author playing omniscient narrator, writing the scene as if he had a microphone hidden in the bushes or a supernatural transcript delivered by angels. An honest historical account would say something like, "We disciples fell asleep and don't know what Jesus prayed." But the Gospels don't do that. They give us direct quotations with zero acknowledgement that nobody was actually listening. Not a hint of, we're not sure about this part, or Jesus may have prayed something like this. Nope. Full confidence, exact words, no caveats. Here's another one. In John 18, we get this extended private conversation between Jesus and Pontius Pilate inside the praetorium, the governor's residence. Pilate calls Jesus inside, away from the crowd, and they have this philosophical exchange about kingship and truth. My kingdom is not of this world, Jesus says. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. Great dialogue. Very dramatic. One small problem. Who was in the room? I mean, really think about that. Who was in the room? The disciples had fled when Jesus was arrested. Mark tells us that explicitly. The beloved disciple shows up later at the cross, but there's no indication any of Jesus' followers were inside Pilate's quarters during this interrogation. Yale historian Del Martin puts it bluntly. Even if there were some kind of trial of Jesus, there is no way information about it would have survived to be transmitted to his disciples. If any such hearings took place, they did so behind closed doors without stenographers or note takers, and with no one to report later to the disciples. So where did this dialogue come from? The answer is obvious. A Christian author invented it later. As Bart Ehrman notes, an early Christian must have come up with the words that seemed appropriate to the occasion. Ladies and gentlemen, that is not eyewitness testimony. That's creative writing. It gets even better. The gospel writers don't just describe scenes they couldn't have witnessed, they also claim to know what people were thinking. Crazy. Let me show you. Mark 15:10 tells us that Pilate perceived that it was out of envy that the chief priest handed Jesus over. How would Mark know Pilate's inner thoughts? Did Pilate send out a press release? Just wanted everyone to know I totally figured out the priests were jealous. Matthew's gospel knows that Herod was troubled when he heard about Jesus' birth. Matthew also knows exactly what Pilate's wife dreamed and what she told her husband in private. Really? The author of Matthew had sources in Pilate's own bedroom? Luke 7:39 describes a Pharisee thinking to himself that Jesus shouldn't let a sinful woman touch him. I mean, think about that. The Pharisee, he knows his thoughts. How does Luke know the thoughts? Mark, too, has scribes silently doubting Jesus, and the narrator casually informs us that Jesus knew in his spirit what they were questioning internally. This is God's eye view narration. Scholars Davies and Allison point out that Matthew feels perfectly free to inform his readers not just about objective events, but also about subjective experiences. This is consistent with his stance as an omniscient narrator. His knowledge is not hindered by any circumstance. Yeah, his knowledge is not hindered by any circumstance. That's a nice way of saying the author writes as if he knows literally everything, which is not how actual eyewitnesses operate. Let's talk about the nativity. Matthew 2 tells us that wise men from the east visited baby Jesus. But before they get to Bethlehem, they stop in Jerusalem and have a secret meeting with King Herod. Matthew then tells us that the Magi were warned in a dream not to return to Herod, so they went home by another route. How would any Christian know about Herod's private consultation with foreign dignitaries, or about their dreams? Did the Magi send a letter back from Persia? Dear Jesus' family, just wanted to let you know about our travel plans and the content of our dreams. Come on. This is just too much. Matthew also tells us that after the resurrection, the chief priest bribed the Roman guards to spread a false story about the disciples stealing Jesus' body. This is described as a hush-hush conspiracy among people who are hostile to the Jesus movement. How would Christians get access to the details of that meeting? Also, how would they bribe people, guards, who witnessed angels descend from heaven? I mean, it's silly in and of itself, but how did they get those details? The answer is they didn't. The author is filling in the narrative with whatever serves his theological purposes. It's storytelling, not journalism. Now, some apologists will concede that, yeah, okay, maybe the gospel writers weren't literal eyewitnesses to everything, but they'll point to something called undesigned coincidences as evidence that the gospels are still historically reliable. The argument goes like this. Sometimes two gospels have details that interlock in subtle ways. One gospel raises a question that another gospel answers with a small detail. Apologists say these casual agreements suggest both accounts are grounded in real history, because forgers wouldn't accidentally create such complementary details. Let me give you an example they love. In John 6, before the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus asks Philip specifically where to buy bread. Why Philip? John doesn't say, but Luke's gospel mentions that this miracle happened near Bethsaida. And John 1 tells us Philip was from Bethsaida. So Jesus asked the local guy. Neat, right? Apologists present this as evidence of genuine historical memory. The two accounts fit together in a way that seems unplanned. Here's the problem. We know the synoptic gospels are literarily connected. Matthew and Luke both used Mark as a source. They copy him word for word in many places.
Was that it was word for word identical?
Word for word.
Word for word.
Wow.
Yeah.
So when Matthew leaves out a detail that Mark includes, it's usually because Matthew edited his source, not because he's an independent witness. And here's the bigger issue. Finding occasional overlaps doesn't validate everything else. You could find undesigned coincidences in the King Arthur legends or stories about Robin Hood. Consistent details can arise from shared traditions and sources, just as easily as from historical reality. Meanwhile, the apologists who obsess over these minor coincidences conveniently ignore the massive contradictions between the Gospels. The resurrection accounts alone are a mess. Mark says the women fled the tomb and told no one. Matthew and Luke say they reported to the disciples. That's not a coincidence, that's a contradiction. John has Jesus dying before the Passover meal. Mark has him eating the Passover meal and dying the next day. You can't have it both ways. The genealogies in Matthew and Luke trace Jesus' ancestry through completely different people. One apologetic move is to say one is Joseph's line and one is Mary's, except both texts explicitly say they're Joseph's genealogy. So yeah, cherry-picking a few overlapping details while ignoring these glaring problems isn't exactly a slam dunk for historical reliability. Look, pointing out these issues doesn't mean everything in the Gospels is fiction. There could be genuine historical kernels underneath the literary embellishment, but we have to approach these texts honestly. Once we see the obvious creativity, how can one honestly say what certainly happened, or with any serious amount of confidence assert something in the gospel narratives happened as written? The Gospels are theological narratives written decades after Jesus by educated Greek-speaking Christians who were not among the original Galilean disciples. They were compiling traditions, editing earlier sources, and shaping the story to fit their theological purposes. This isn't even accounting for the creative rewriting of the Greek Old Testament into Jesus narratives, which we've covered in other videos like the one I recently released called Inventing Judas, How Judas Debunks Gospel Historicity. You see, Each author of a gospel is like a filmmaker making a movie which could be based on true events or not. They add scenes, invent dialogue, and create narrative tension. Mark portrays a human Jesus who dies abandoned. Matthew shows a Jesus who fulfills every prophecy. Luke emphasizes forgiveness and innocence, but also in that garden scene is seen somewhat like Socrates, facing his death without fear and forgiving his enemies. John presents a cosmic divine figure who's in total control. None of this reads like someone's diary. It reads like theological literature designed to inspire belief, which is exactly what John 20:31 admits. These things are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Son of God. When confronted with all this, some Christians say, well, maybe God revealed these unknowable details to the gospel writers through the Holy Spirit. Fine. That's a faith claim. But notice what you've just done. You've admitted that normal, human eyewitness testimony isn't sufficient to explain what's in the Gospels. You're saying supernatural revelation was necessary to fill the gaps. That's not really an eyewitness account anymore, is it? So let's put all of this together. If the Gospel writers were really careful investigators, if Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John actually conducted thorough research, interviewed eyewitnesses, and pieced together reliable testimony, let's count exactly how many people they would have needed to track down. 26. At minimum, 26 separate witnesses. They'd need to interview Jesus' mother, Mary, who would have been over 100 years old by the time the Gospels were written, for details about the birth and childhood stories. They'd need to find the Bethlehem shepherds who saw the angels. They'd need to travel over 1,000 miles to Persia to locate the Magi, almost certainly dead by then, to ask about their secret meeting with King Herod and the dream that warned them to flee. Oh, and for the temptation in the wilderness, they'd need to sit down with the devil himself. He's the only other witness to that conversation. But we're just getting started. They'd need someone from the synagogue in Nazareth who tried to throw Jesus off a cliff. They'd need the Pharisees in Capernaum to confess what they were questioning in their hearts. They'd need the religious leaders in Jerusalem to reveal the private discussions they had about how to trap Jesus with trick questions. They'd need the widow of Nain or her resurrected son for their backstory. They need the Samaritan woman at the well to recount her private conversation with Jesus. A conversation none of the disciples were around to hear. They need the royal official from Cana to describe what he experienced when he got home. They need the man healed at the pool of Bethsaida for his backstory. They need the man born blind to describe his interrogation by the Pharisees. They need the Gerasene demoniacs or someone who saw them to explain what happened after Jesus sent them into the Decapolis. They'd need the woman with the discharge of blood to share what she was secretly thinking when she touched Jesus' garment. They need someone from Herod Antipas's inner court for Herod's private speculation that Jesus was John the Baptist risen from the dead, and how Herod felt about executing John, and his reaction when Pilate sent Jesus to him. They'd need the Syrophoenician woman in Tyre to describe what she found when she returned home. They need the woman with the disabling spirit for her backstory. They'd need one of the Pharisees present when Caiaphas prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation. They would literally need the ghost of Judas Iscariot, a dead man, to reveal the secret details of his betrayal, because as soon as he betrayed Christ, he then went and committed suicide. They need someone present at Jesus' trial before the Sanhedrin, a closed-door session in the middle of the night. They need one of the Jewish guards to confess how they mocked and beat Jesus while he was in custody. They need the Roman governor Pontius Pilate to share his private thoughts during the trial. and his wife to describe her dream about Jesus. They need Simon of Cyrene for information about himself and his sons Alexander and Rufus. They need one of the priests inside the Jerusalem temple who saw the curtain rip in two. And they need one of the Roman soldiers who were bribed by the chief priest to lie and say the disciples stole the body. 26 witnesses exposed. Now, could a few of these have been accessible? Maybe. Luke mentions a woman named Joanna, married to Herod's household manager, who could have been a source for some court gossip. But the rest? The gospel writers would have needed to travel from Capernaum to Bethany to Tyre to Samaria to the Decapolis to Rome to Persia. They'd need hostile Pharisees, Roman officials, and temple priests, people who despised this movement, to sit down and share their innermost thoughts, their private deliberations, their secret bribes, with followers of the man they helped execute. Honestly, does that sound like what happened? Or does it sound completely absurd? Here's the bottom line. The gospel writers act like omniscient authors because that's exactly what they are. Authors. They're writing literature of faith, not investigative journalism. They describe private conversations no one overheard. They narrate inner thoughts no one could access. They recount events where no human witness was present. And not once, not a single time, do they pause to admit, we don't know what happened here, or nobody was around to see this. They just barrel forward with total narrative confidence because they're telling a story. Now, does this mean we just throw the Gospels in the trash? No. There may be genuine historical kernels buried beneath or underneath all the literary embellishment. But it does mean we need to stop pretending these are neutral historical documents. They're not courtroom quality eyewitness testimony at all, and they never claim to be. And before someone brings up undesigned coincidences, no. At best, that shows the gospel traditions share some underlying coherence, which is exactly what you'd expect from stories circulating in the same communities, drawing on the same sources, and that's the literary approach, which I typically lean on, is that the Gospels are using each other's materials, whether there was a Q document or not. It doesn't magically transform theological storytelling into reliable history. And it certainly doesn't explain how the authors knew what Satan whispered in the desert or what Jesus prayed in Gethsemane while every single disciple was asleep, or what Pilate's wife dreamed, or what the Pharisees thought in their hearts. If you want to read the Gospels as sacred scripture, that's your choice. If they inspire you spiritually, I'm not here to take that from you. But if you're going to claim these texts are eyewitness accounts of real events, if you're going to use them as evidence in historical debates, then you need to deal with what the texts themselves actually show. All the internal evidence points in the opposite direction. These gospel authors wrote as though they were there, but they weren't. They inherited stories from decades of oral tradition, likely some of that, but were crafting and shaping these stories to fit their theological agendas. They were clever authors. They filled in the gaps with imagination. And recognizing that doesn't diminish these texts. It helps us finally see them for what they actually are. Fascinating windows into early Christian belief, not what apologists wish they were. Thanks for watching. If this video made you think, hit that subscribe button and consider supporting MythVision on Patreon. Your support is what makes this work possible. We've got a lot more coming that digs into where these stories actually came from. I'll see you in the next one, and never forget, ladies and gentlemen, we are MythVision.